It can be tricky, but I want people to know that as much as they think this conversation might be really awkward and that it will go poorly and that their parents are going to get mad and storm off, that is probably not going to happen in most cases, as long as you approach the conversation out of love and respect. Now, there are going to be some parents who will not want to have this conversation, no matter what approach you take, no matter how many times you try, but most parents are going to be willing to share some information. And there are a variety of ways you can start the conversation so it isn't so awkward.
Hey y'all, this is Kosta, and today I'm here with my guest, Cameron Huddleston, author, speaker, and award-winning journalist with 20 years of experience writing about personal finance. Today, we're talking about how to approach your parents about their finances. So, Cameron, in your opinion, what is one of the biggest misconceptions people have when it comes to talking about finances with their parents?
I think the biggest misconception is that this conversation doesn't need to happen until there is a need for it, such as a health emergency, or the parents have a financial emergency until they've already retired or until they are asking for help. But that is not the time to have these conversations. These conversations need to happen while your parents are still relatively young and healthy, and even ideally before they have retired. Because if you wait for that emergency, then what happens? Emotions are running high. Of course, people aren't thinking rationally. You can't have a rational conversation. And honestly, the last thing people want to talk about is finances when there's an emergency. And so these conversations need to happen sooner rather than later.
How do you suggest approaching the conversation of finances with parents who, I don't know, may be resistant or uncomfortable talking about money?
It can be tricky, but I want people to know that as much as they think this conversation might be really awkward and that it will go poorly and that their parents are going to get mad and storm off, that is probably not going to happen in most cases, as long as you approach the conversation out of love and respect. Now, there are going to be some parents who will not want to have this conversation, no matter what approach you take, no matter how many times you try, but most parents are going to be willing to share some information. And there are a variety of ways you can start the conversation so it isn't so awkward. If you are still relatively young yourself, you're in your 20s or your 30s, a really natural way is to ask your parents for advice, because parents love giving their kids advice. And so you can say something like, hey, mom and dad, I'm getting married soon. Should I have a will now? Do I need to have life insurance? Their answers are going to give you insight into what sort of planning they have done, because they might say, oh, yes, definitely, you need a will. Your father and I have a will. You definitely need life insurance. You've got someone else who's counting on you for support if something happens to you. Or they might say, I don't know. I never bothered to get a will. And I had a term life insurance policy that expired years ago. And so you think, well, my parents don't have a will. Right. We need to start having some conversations. And so that's one way to do it. If you are in midlife, maybe in your later 30s, your 40s, your early 50s, you probably have a story that you can share about someone who did have to get involved with their parents' finances. Maybe they stepped into a caregiving role, or maybe they had a parent who passed away and that parent did a great job of planning, and you can tell your parents, hey, my friend recently lost her father, and it was such a relief to her that he had everything in place. He had a will, he had named an executor, he had a list of all of his accounts, and it just made it so much easier for my friend. Or you can share a horror story about a friend or a colleague or someone whose parent died without a will, and what a nightmare it was for their family. And so a story is another way to do it. If money is not a taboo topic in your family and you have a good relationship with your parents, there's really nothing wrong with taking a direct approach just by saying something like, look, mom and dad, I love you. And if you ever need help, I want to be able to help you. But in order to do that, I'm going to need some information. So there are a lot of different ways you can approach the conversation. But again, it's important to start trying sooner rather than later, because with some parents, it can take a while to get through to them and to get them comfortable enough to start sharing some information. For some people, it can even take years. So the sooner you start getting them comfortable with the idea of having these conversations, the more time you're actually going to have to get them to start taking action, to plan, and to plan with you so that you are prepared to get involved with their finances as they age and when they pass away.
You know, you've been doing this for 20 years, specifically working in personal finance. And, you know, the statistics for people's finances are not great, right? So, you know, as Americans, we tend to carry a lot of debt, and we tend to buy in too much into the consumerism, materialism aspect of things. And so, you know, we don't save enough money and all that stuff. And I just got to ask, how do you, like, say, for example, if you're a son or a daughter of somebody that's, you know, turning 50, right? And usually chronic illnesses or serious medical events typically start to happen after the age of 50. But let's say you don't have your own house in order. How do you contend with talking to your parents when you yourself may not have the confidence to do so?
So you are right. A lot of us do not have our financial acts together. But that doesn't mean that you can't have these conversations. It's really important to keep in mind that you should never be condescending when having these conversations. Perhaps your parents are the ones who don't have their financial acts together. So you don't want to, you know, approach the conversation by saying something like, Mom and Dad, I'm really worried that I am going to have to bail you out in retirement because you don't have enough money to support yourself. Now, I doubt anyone would say that, but I think you get my point.
You'd be surprised.
You need to be careful. This is true. This is true. But you've got to be careful about what you say and how you say it. But again, if you don't have your own financial act together, this is a really easy end to having these conversations, because you can ask your parents for advice.
Yeah.
Mom and Dad, I really need your help. I have been struggling with debt, and I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for me on how to get out of debt. And you might discover that your parents are in a similar situation. And so then it's something that you can do together.
Rally
you can say,
around
well, you know
each
what?
other, yeah.
You're right. Exactly. Hey, you know, I heard about this debt payoff strategy. Maybe we should try it together, and we can hold each other accountable. We can check in with each other every month to see, you know, how much debt we've managed to pay off that much, and how much money we've, you know, saved so that we can, you know, increase the payments that we're making on our credit cards. And so it can be something you can do together. In fact, there was a young woman I interviewed for my book, and she did exactly that. She invited her mom to go to a seminar series on getting their finances in order. And doing that together gave her mom the confidence to start sharing some information with her daughter and to let her know that she was having issues staying on top of her finances.
Yeah.
And so that opened the door to some really open and honest conversations.
So let's say that we never get to that point and we never have this conversation. What normally happens when people try to ignore the issue and let their families stay on a financial cruise control?
Well, let's say that mom has a stroke. She's in her 70s, and, you know, maybe dad has passed away, or maybe they got divorced years ago. And mom does not have any sort of estate planning documents. There's no power of attorney to name someone to make financial decisions for her if she can't. There's no healthcare power of attorney that names someone to make medical decisions for her. There's no living will spelling out what sort of end-of-life medical care she does or does not want. Mom's in the hospital, no one can get access to her bank account to pay the bills. The doctors don't want to talk to you because you haven't been named healthcare power of attorney. And so then you have to go through the court system to be named her conservator or guardian to prove that she is no longer mentally competent enough to manage her finances or to manage her care on her own. This process can take several months. It can cost several $1,000s. It can be incredibly emotionally taxing. This can all be avoided by having these conversations as soon as possible to make sure that your parents have those essential estate planning documents. And you notice I didn't even mention a will because I truly think that that power of attorney and the healthcare proxy are more important because without them, there's no one to make financial and medical decisions for the parents. And like I said, you have to go through the court system. But you do want to make sure they have a will or a trust or something that spells out who gets what when they die, because if your parents die without a will, state law determines who gets what. And if they're stepkids, and I know you're in a blended family situation, so, if your dad were to die without a will and you're the only child on his blood in his bloodline, you would get everything.
Yeah.
Stepkids would get nothing. Right. That's just the way typically state intestacy laws work. And so, if these conversations haven't happened, it can create all sorts of headaches. It
is phenomenal that so few people actually plan for end of life. And when you brought up the power of attorney, I didn't even, as we're having this conversation, it didn't even cross my mind. But I work in long-term care, and so often family members who are truly concerned about whether it's the finances of an individual that receives services or someone's medical conditions, just something as simple as, getting an update from a doctor at a hospital on the condition of their mom or dad. You can't do either. You can't talk about their finances, and you can't tell them anything about their medical care and their care in general. And you would think that as more people age and more people start to receive services, that these conversations are having a wider range or a wider effect, and are happening more often. So I got to ask, do you feel like we are headed in the right direction? Are you optimistic that people are having these types of conversations more often, or do you think that there's still some reluctancy for kids and parents to kind of get on the same page?
I do think that one good thing that came out of the pandemic was that it led to more of these conversations. It did lead to more planning. There was an uptick in the number of people who were getting wills. There was an uptick in the number of people who were getting life insurance policies. But those numbers are still low. And what always surprises me is when you have adults who have had to care for their parents, yet they haven't had those conversations with their adult children about their own plans and what type of care they want. They struggled through being a family caregiver, and you'd think that they would have learned the lesson of planning a little bit better, but I don't know. Maybe they're thinking, well, it's not going to happen to me. I take the opposite approach. It happened to my mom. It could very well happen to me. And so I have done a lot of planning, and I have gone so far to, tell my kids what I do and do not expect of them. And my daughters are teenagers. My son's 11. So they're still young.
Could you share that personal experience with your parents, specifically about how you had those tough conversations and how that impacted your family's financial future?
Sure. So my parents actually divorced while I was in college. My dad got remarried, and he passed away at the age of 61 in a second marriage, and he died without a will. And the thing is, he should have known better because he was an attorney. I was shocked, but my dad never wanted to talk about death. I remember after my parents got divorced, my mom asking me to please have a conversation with my dad about what his final wishes were, because she said, oh, he would always tell me, just sharpen my toes and hammer me into the ground. She's like, you need to find out what his wishes are. But I didn't listen to my mom because, I don't know, I was in my early 20s or whatever. I didn't think it was a conversation that I needed to have. Exactly. Surely he was just joking. Surely he had a plan. And then when I was 28 and he was 61, he passed away without a will. There was no plan. It was awkward for sure. It could have been a lot worse. But, you know, my sister and I will never know what his wishes were because he didn't put them in writing. My mother, when she was 65, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. I was 35 at the time. We had a conversation about long-term care insurance several years prior to her diagnosis. I, sat her down and I said, Mom, you need to look into getting long-term care insurance in case something happens to you so you could pay for your care. But she didn't qualify because she had another pre-existing condition that made her too high risk. And I should have used that opportunity to have more conversations with her. Okay, let's look at your finances and figure out how you would pay for care if you needed it. What type of care do you want? But I didn't have that conversation. Totally dropped the ball. And so when she was starting to show signs of memory loss, I had to scramble to get her in with an attorney to update all those legal documents so that I could be named her financial power of attorney, her healthcare power of attorney, so that her will could be updated, her living will could be updated. And so we got that in place. And then, we went to the bank with that power of attorney document to let the bank know that I was now her power of attorney and that I could have access to her accounts. But I had to play detective to get the information I needed about her finances as she was forgetting the details herself. In fact, there was one account of hers that I didn't even know existed until she was already in a memory care facility, and I was getting letters telling me that this account was about to be turned over to the state as unclaimed property for inactivity. And I was like, what is this? What is this account? I didn't even know it existed. $50,000 in the account that once I was finally able to get access to it, it helped pay for nearly a year's worth of care. But, these sort of things could have been avoided if I had simply taken an opportunity that really was given to me with the whole long-term care insurance situation to have a conversation with her about her finances. Now, I'm lucky because as a personal finance journalist, I knew what to do. I knew those legal documents needed to be in place. I knew, I had a pretty good understanding of how Social Security, Medicare worked. I had a decent understanding of how the long-term care system worked. A lot of people have no understanding of how these things work. They have no understanding of how to manage someone else's finances. And so it can be a real struggle for a lot of people. It wasn't easy for me, but it could have been a lot worse.
And what always is astounding to me is even people that are receiving services. Like some people with regards to Alzheimer's and dementia care may feel the necessity to leave home and go and essentially seek those services out on their own, knowing I can't live on my own anymore. I need to go to an assisted living facility. And even while they're in this assisted living facility declining, their family members haven't had the forethought to say, hey, listen, it's probably a good idea that we get all of this set up now. Because especially in today's day and age, and I'm curious if you've ever encountered this, when people start to show signs of not early onset Alzheimer's, but when you're really kind of in the thick of it, there are some attorneys and legal systems that are very reluctant to sign over somebody's rights to another person. And you really have to spend a lot of time, a lot of money providing the necessary documentation for them to feel comfortable for you to become a conservator or a rep payee or just a power of attorney for that matter. So I think you're absolutely right. I think starting early is absolutely the best route.
Right, because you do have to be mentally competent to sign those documents. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you are in the very early stages of dementia, that an attorney won't draft those documents. Then that's why it's important to meet with an attorney, an estate planning attorney or elder law attorney, is so that that attorney can sit down and talk with the adult to determine whether they are still aware enough and to determine if they understand what they are signing. And if they can determine that, which was the case with my mom, the attorney drafted the document, she signed it, she was aware of what she was doing. But yes, if you are, in the middle stage of Alzheimer's disease, most attorneys would not consider you competent enough, and they shouldn't, because you can be manipulated by someone who wants you to give them that power to make financial decisions for them. And they have to be careful to protect that older adult from exploitation. And so
absolutely,
that's why it's so important to make sure that your parents have these documents in place while they are still healthy and competent. Otherwise, it can be too late.
Yeah. When I think about all the conversation that we're having right now and the topics that we're bringing up, the points we're making, I think a lot of it goes back to finding balance, right? And many adult children struggle with balancing respecting their parents' privacy and independence with ensuring their financial security. How do you suggest finding a balance between those two things? Well,
again, as I said earlier, these conversations need to come from a place of love and respect. You remember, these are your parents.
Absolutely.
You are still the child. But I do think it's important to focus on the independence aspect. So maybe you say something like, I know you want to remain independent for as long as possible. Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't want to be independent? And so in order to help you remain independent, I think there's some things that you can do so that you can have things in place to ensure that your wishes are carried out. And in order for your wishes to be carried out, there have to be things in writing. I know a lot of times people think, well, I don't want to name someone as my power of attorney because I don't want to give them that much power now. And so you're having this conversation with mom and dad. You say, look, don't you want to have a say in who gets to make financial decisions for you? Of course you do. Well, if you can draft this power of attorney document now, you can choose the person or the people you want to make these decisions. And if you choose me, that's fine. That's great. I will be there to support you, and I'll step into that role if you need me to. You don't have to give me this document now. I don't have any power without that power of attorney document. I can't just go to your bank and say, Mom may name me power of attorney. Let me see what's going on in that bank account. And let me start signing checks for her. They have to see the document. So you just tell your parents, look, get the documents drafted and signed, put them someplace safe, and tell me when and how I can access them. You don't have to tell me the details of your finances, but write them down for me. Put it with those estate planning documents, put that list, and then again, tell me when and how I can access the list. Just make sure that I can get to it when the time comes that I need to be involved. And this lets your parents maintain control. Lets them know that you want a system in place to be able to help them, but it also lets them know, I'm not looking to take over your finances right now. You're still fine, okay? But we need a plan in case something happens.
And I know that we've brought this up earlier about, it doesn't really matter what age necessarily or financial circumstances you're in. It runs the gambit. You just need to have this conversation. But, people, they really need a little bit more direction. So I just want to emphasize, is there a specific age or financial circumstance that people find themselves in when they really have to talk to their parents about their finances or their plans for retirement? And what happens if they're past that time frame and it's kind of too late and they're in that crisis mode that you were describing?
So I think if you can aim to have this conversation by the time your parents reach age 60, because most people most people are not going to retire until they're at least 62, because that is the earliest age at which you can start collecting Social Security benefits. A lot of people are going to wait until they're 65, 67 when they can collect full Social Security benefits, maybe even 70. But by 60, you're still getting ahead of the curve when it comes to retirement planning. Again, a lot of healthcare issues, including dementia, will probably not start to crop up until later in their 60s, 70s, 80s, if you're lucky. And so 60 is kind of a good age to aim for having these conversations. Again, the sooner the better. If there is already a crisis, that does not mean it is too late. It just means that the conversation has to start right now. Right now. If there has been a diagnosis of dementia, there needs to be a family meeting so that parents, children can sit down together and talk about what needs that parent is going to have as the dementia progresses, what role they expect family members to play. Doctors aren't necessarily going to be telling people that they need to do this, because this was my experience with my mom. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and it was like, okay, here's some medicine to take that might slow down the decline of her memory loss. Good luck. No one said, your mother now has Alzheimer's disease. Someone needs to be managing her finances for her, or at least keeping an eye on them until her Alzheimer's disease progresses. Because if you've already been diagnosed with dementia, you're already making mistakes with your money. Someone has got to be involved from the get-go, because you don't want your parents to be exploited. You don't want them to be making mistakes that could leave them in financial dire straits. They're going to need that money to pay for their care. And so if there's been any sort of diagnosis, if there is a health issue, if they are experiencing any sort of financial setback, you can't wait at that point. You've got to call that family meeting and start talking, and talk to your siblings too, because all of you need to be on the same page. You don't want to go to your parents and leave your siblings out of the conversation, because that could create issues with your siblings, thinking that you're going behind their backs, and they're going to be wondering what you're saying to mom and dad and what you're doing. And especially if you start managing their money, they're going to get really suspicious.
So step one is the family meeting. That's a really good point. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about your book, Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk: How to Have Essential Conversations with Your Parents About Their Finances. What do you hope readers gain from this work?
Well, I certainly hope that they realize that, like I've said already, they need to have these conversations sooner rather than later. These conversations probably are not going to be nearly as awkward as they think. I hope they gain a framework for how to have these conversations and what sort of questions to ask. And as I point out in the final chapter, I hope they realize that they need to pay it forward and have these conversations with their own children, if they have children, so that they're not perpetuating that cycle of silence, and the cycle of, if you've got a parent who's counting on you for financial support, you're not going to continue that and cause your children to have to support you financially someday.
We always like to end the show with a call to action. What's your best advice on initiating the conversation about retirement planning, long-term care, and end-of-life related expenses with parents who may not have planned for it?
Again, try to have this conversation as soon as possible. Realize that it could take several attempts and several different approaches before they're willing to open up, but don't give up. Just don't give up, because the consequences of not having these conversations are really much worse than you think this conversation might be.